"You're such a saint, Sarah," my mom gushed, her voice practically dripping with pride. "We don't know what we'd do without you." I stayed quiet, my fork hovering over my plate, while Sarah, sitting across from me, smiled that picture-perfect, self-satisfied grin she wore so well. She didn't even glance in my direction, like she knew I wouldn't say anything. Like I couldn't say anything. "My name is Julia Mitchell. I'm 27 years old, and I'm an elementary school teacher. For as long as I can remember, I've been the one who picks up the pieces in this family, but no one ever notices. My older sister, Sarah, has always been the golden child, the charming, charismatic one. Me? I'm the dependable one, the one who quietly steps in when things fall apart. For years, I've been sending money to my parents to help with their medical bills, making sacrifices while Sarah soaks up all the credit. But recently, I decided I'd had enough. And now, the fallout has started. I remember the day I made the decision to stop sending money like it was yesterday. It wasn't planned, no grand gesture. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, staring at the numbers on my bank account after paying rent, and something inside me just snapped. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, barely scraping by while Sarah played the hero. I never told anyone. I just stopped. At first, nothing happened. Weeks passed, and I waited for someone to notice, to say something. But everything stayed quiet, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe they had figured it out, that Sarah wasn't actually footing the bills like they believed. Then the calls started. My mom asking why certain payments were late, my dad mentioning a few overdue notices they'd received. Sarah, of course, stayed silent, probably hoping no one would put two and two together. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon when my mom called me, her voice tight with frustration. "Julia, your dad's insurance payment is overdue again. Did something happen to Sarah's account? She said she's been handling everything, but things keep slipping through the cracks." My chest tightened as I gripped the phone. It was the first time I'd heard even a hint of doubt in my mom's voice about Sarah. I wanted to scream, "It's not Sarah! It's been me this whole time." But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "Maybe you should ask Sarah directly." It felt like a small rebellion, not giving them the answers they wanted, letting the truth simmer instead of throwing it in their faces. For once, I wanted them to figure it out on their own. Still, the guilt gnawed at me every time my parents sounded stressed or confused. I hated feeling responsible, even though deep down I knew I wasn't. As the weeks dragged on, things started to unravel. My mom called more often, sounding more anxious each time. Sarah said she's trying to work it out, but the hospital keeps sending these notices. "Your father can't miss his treatments, Julia," she snapped one evening. Meanwhile, Sarah's Instagram painted a different picture. Photos of her sipping cocktails on rooftop bars and unboxing expensive skincare products. I couldn't believe it. She was still acting like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't the reason our parents were struggling. Then came the family dinner. My mom insisted we all get together to talk things through. I knew what that meant. She'd call on Sarah to explain the situation, and I'd sit there, the invisible daughter, nodding along while Sarah spun some story. But this time, things didn't go as planned. My dad, usually the quiet one, looked Sarah dead in the eye and said, "You've been handling this for months, Sarah. What's going on? Why can't you keep up with the payments?" The color drained from her face, and for once I saw a crack in her perfect facade. Sarah stammered, something about unexpected expenses and a temporary hiccup, but it was clear she hadn't prepared for this. My mom jumped in, her tone sharp as ever. "She's doing her best, Robert. Why don't you lay off her and Julia?" she said, turning her gaze to me. "Maybe it's time you step up and help for once. You don't do anything for us as it is." I felt the words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the sheer unfairness of it making my chest ache. I looked at Sarah, who refused to meet my eyes, and then back at my mom, whose expression was filled with disappointment, directed at me, of course. My dad stayed silent like always, and I realized they genuinely believed it. They believed Sarah had been carrying this burden all along, and I was just some selfish bystander. My hands were shaking, but I managed to say, "That's not true, Mom. I've been helping. I've been the one paying those bills for years." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. My mom broke it with a scoff, shaking her head. "Julia, don't be ridiculous. Sarah is the one paying for everything. She's been working so hard to keep us afloat. You've done nothing to help us, and now you're trying to take credit for her sacrifices?" My stomach churned, and my hands gripped the edge of the table to keep steady. I glanced at Sarah, who sat there like a statue, her face frozen in an expression that was part shock, part guilt. She wasn't even trying to defend herself. The words spilled out before I could stop them. "That's not true, Mom. It's never been true. For 3 years, I've been sending money to cover those bills. Every month. Sarah hasn't paid for a single thing." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep going. "And you know what? I stopped because I was tired of being invisible while she took all the credit." Sarah's head snapped up, her face twisted with disbelief. "What is wrong with you, Julia? Why are you making up these lies?" she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "This is insane. I've been the one helping Mom and Dad all along, and now you're trying to make me look bad?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you seriously going to sit there and pretend I'm lying? Sarah, I have bank statements, receipts, 3 years of them. Do you want me to show everyone right now?" "Receipts?" she repeated with a mocking laugh. "What receipts, Julia? You're just bitter because Mom and Dad appreciate what I do for them. You've been sitting on the sidelines while I've been keeping this family together, and now you want to swoop in and rewrite history?" "Rewriting history?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You've been stealing credit for everything I've done, Sarah. I'm the one who's been sending money month after month while you've been spending your paychecks on spa days and luxury vacations." Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes darting toward our mom. "You see, Mom, this is what I'm talking about. Julia always plays the victim. She's just trying to tear me down because she can't stand that I actually help you." Her words were dripping with fake hurt, but I noticed how her voice cracked, just slightly, at the end. Sarah's voice shot across the table, sharp and accusing. "If you were really helping Julia, why the heck didn't you say a word for 3 years? And now, suddenly, you're bringing this up. Let me guess. You wouldn't have said anything if it weren't for the credit. Admit it. You're just mad because I'm the one they thank. It doesn't make sense otherwise." My mom folded her arms, nodding in agreement. "Sarah's right, Julia. Why wouldn't you tell us sooner if you were helping all this time? You expect us to believe this now, after all these years. It feels strange, Julia. It really does." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, my frustration boiling over. "Because I wasn't doing it for the credit," I said, my voice trembling. "I did it because I wanted to help you. I didn't think I needed to parade it around for validation. And yes, maybe I should have spoken up earlier, but why does that make it okay for Sarah to take credit for something she didn't do?" Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Julia. You're acting like I forced you into silence or something. If this is even true, which I doubt, why wait until now to throw it in everyone's face? Because you're bitter. That's why. This has nothing to do with helping and everything to do with you trying to make me look bad." My dad shook his head slightly, his voice calm but questioning. "Julia, it's hard to understand why you'd keep quiet all this time if it's really true. I just don't get it." Their doubt was crushing, and Sarah's smug expression only made it worse. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady as I turned to face Sarah directly. "I didn't say anything because I was happy to help Mom and Dad," I said firmly. "I didn't need the recognition. I was doing it for them, not for anyone's approval. But when I realized what you were doing, taking credit for my sacrifices, I couldn't believe it. So I decided to wait, to see just how long you'd keep up the lie." Sarah's face flushed with anger, but she didn't back down. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're saying you let me take the credit, just sat there silently for years, and now you're trying to flip this on me? You could have stopped it at any time, Julia." But no, you waited until now, conveniently, when you think you can humiliate me. I waited, I said, cutting her off, because I wanted to see if you'd ever own up to it, if you'd ever have the decency to admit the truth on your own. But you didn't, Sarah. You just kept letting everyone believe your story while I worked myself to the bone. I turned to my parents, who looked stunned, their expressions a mix of doubt and confusion. I didn't want this fight, but I'm not going to let her rewrite history anymore. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I have all the receipts, Mom. Every bank statement, every proof of payment for the past 3 years. It would take me less than 5 minutes to pull them up and show you, but that's not the point. I turned to Sarah, locking eyes with her. What I want is for you to admit what you've been doing. Just be honest for once. Sarah crossed her arms, her face hardening into a mask of defiance. I don't know what you're talking about, she said coolly, though her voice wavered just slightly. I've been the one handling things. If you have proof, then show it, Julia. Otherwise, stop making up these stories to make me look bad. The audacity of her words made my blood boil, but I stayed calm. Why should I have to show it, Sarah? You already know the truth. If you had any integrity, you'd admit it yourself instead of digging yourself into a deeper hole. My dad leaned forward, his face pale, but my mom still looked at me with suspicion, as if she couldn't decide who to believe. And Sarah? She just sat there, her jaw clenched, refusing to back down. It was infuriating. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up. My voice was shaking, but I kept it firm. I'm done, Sarah. If you're so determined to keep lying, then I have nothing more to say to you. I won't waste my energy trying to get you to admit what we both know is true. I turned to Sarah one last time, my heart heavy but resolute. If there's even a shred of a decent person left inside you, you'll tell Mom and Dad the truth. Until then, don't expect me to answer your calls or texts. I'm done with you. She scoffed, crossing her arms. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Julia. This is ridiculous. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. Without another glance, I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, leaving them all behind. For the first time, I felt like I was finally choosing myself over their endless expectations. It would have been easy to prove it. Pulling out my phone and showing the bank statements would have taken seconds. But that wasn't the point. For me, it was about more than just proving who was right. I wanted Sarah to own up to what she'd done, to finally take responsibility for lying to all of us for so long. Months went by, and the silence between me and my parents grew heavier with each passing day. Our conversations became surface level, strained and short, like they didn't know how to talk to me anymore, or maybe they just didn't want to. I didn't blame them entirely. I knew I'd shattered the image they'd built around Sarah, and they weren't ready to face it. But it still hurt. As for Sarah, I didn't speak to her at all. Not a single text, call, or interaction. I avoided every family gathering where I knew she'd be, even skipping Mom's birthday dinner. I couldn't sit in the same room with her and pretend everything was fine while she kept up the act. It wasn't worth the anger or the exhaustion it brought. My only focus now was on rebuilding my peace. It didn't take long for the cracks in Sarah's perfect facade to show. Word got around that she was struggling financially, missed payments on her car, cutting back on her flashy outings, and even a few not-so-subtle posts on social media about tight budgets and unexpected expenses. It didn't take a genius to figure out why. She had to start making the payments herself to keep up the lie. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. This was the mess she created, and now she had to live with it. I'd sacrificed for years without complaint, and she'd reaped the benefits. Watching her squirm, knowing she was finally feeling the weight of the responsibility she claimed to have all along, was a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't how I wanted things to be, but it was exactly what she deserved. It was a Saturday afternoon when Sarah showed up at my door, unannounced. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and her usual polished demeanor nowhere to be found. For a moment, I just stared, unsure if I should let her in or send her right back down the hallway. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice quiet, almost pleading. It wasn't the Sarah I was used to, and that threw me off. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in, motioning to the couch. She sat down heavily, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with her. I stayed standing, arms crossed, waiting for her to speak. I'm in trouble, Julia," she started, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't keep up with everything anymore. I don't know what to do." I leaned against the wall, keeping my arms crossed, and stared at her. "That's not my problem, Sarah," I said flatly. I could see her flinch, but I didn't feel an ounce of guilt, not after everything she'd done. "You made this bed. Now you get to lie in it." Her eyes widened, and for the first time I saw real panic behind them. "Julia, please. I know I messed up, but I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Messed up? Sarah, you lied. You lied to our parents, to everyone, and you let me carry the weight while you played the hero. And now what? You want me to swoop in and save you? No. I'm not doing it. I'm done." Sarah's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please, Julia, I just need a little help. Things are really bad right now, and I don't have anyone else to turn to." She wiped at her face, her hands trembling. "I know I haven't been fair to you, but you're my sister." I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. "Help?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You're asking me for help? After everything you've done?" She nodded quickly, her eyes red and swollen. "I know I screwed up, okay? But I'm trying, Julia. I'm trying to make things right." I let out a bitter laugh. "Make things right?" "Sarah, you've been lying to my face for years. You want my help? Start by telling Mom and Dad the truth. Until you're willing to do that, I've got nothing for you." Her silence was deafening, and I could see her struggling to come up with something, anything to say. But she didn't. She just looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Sarah straightened up, her voice defensive now. "Look, Julia, I've been making the payments, okay? So technically I'm not lying anymore. I've been handling it, just like everyone thinks I have." I felt my face heat up, my anger bubbling over. "Technically?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself, Sarah? You're not lying anymore? You've been lying for years, letting everyone think you were some kind of savior while I was breaking my back to help. And now you think doing the bare minimum makes it okay?" Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, avoiding my glare. "I'm doing my best, Julia," she muttered. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." "That's the problem, Sarah," I snapped. "You never meant for anything, but you're perfectly fine letting me take the fall so you can keep your perfect little image intact. You're not doing this for them. You're doing it for yourself. Don't act like this makes up for anything." My hands were shaking, but I refused to let her see how much it hurt. Sarah looked up at me, her voice trembling but determined. "Okay, fine. I'll tell Mom and Dad the truth. I'll admit everything. But I need your help first, Julia. Please. Just this once." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity. "You're kidding me, right?" I said, my tone icy. "You're asking me to help you clean up the mess you made and then you'll think about telling the truth? How convenient." Her eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. "No, I swear. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything, I promise. But I'm drowning here, Julia. I just need a little help to get through this, and then I'll come clean, I swear." I let out a bitter laugh, crossing my arms. "So let me get this straight. You're willing to keep lying to Mom and Dad unless I bail you out? And you expect me to believe you'll actually follow through this time?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "No, Sarah. I'm not playing this game with you anymore. If you want to fix this, you don't need my help. You need to tell the truth. Period." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. "Fine. I'll do it. I'll tell the entire family the truth at the reunion next Saturday. Everything. I'll admit it all. She looked at me, her eyes desperate. Will that be enough for you? I paused, an idea forming in the back of my mind. You're going to confess everything? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Yes, she said firmly, nodding. I'll tell them the whole truth, Julia. I swear. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then nodded. All right. If you do it, if you actually stand up in front of the entire family and tell them what you've done, I'll give you the money on Sunday, but only if you go through with it. Sarah hesitated, then nodded quickly, her relief almost palpable. I didn't smile, didn't soften. I just hoped she didn't realize what I was really going to do. The family reunion was in full swing when Sarah stood up, tapping her glass to get everyone's attention. I watched her closely, my arms crossed as I leaned against the wall, not trusting a single word until it actually left her mouth. She cleared her throat, her face pale, but her voice carried over the room. I have something I need to say. Everyone quieted down, the usual hum of chatter replaced with curious glances. My mom looked up expectantly, and my dad furrowed his brows, already sensing something was off. Sarah took a deep breath, gripping the edge of her chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For the past few years, everyone has thought I was the one helping Mom and Dad with their bills, she began, her voice shaking slightly. But that wasn't true. It wasn't me. It was Julia. The room fell silent, stunned faces staring back at her. My mom blinked, her mouth opening and closing, trying to process what she'd just heard. My dad was the first to speak, his voice thick with disbelief. Wait, what are you saying, Sarah? I'm saying that Julia was the one sending the money all this time, Sarah admitted, her voice cracking. And I let you think it was me. I lied. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her words had finally crushed her. I'm sorry. My mom's face crumpled as she looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. Julia, we didn't believe you. We called you a liar. She shook her head, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. How could we not see it? My dad stood crossing the room to me, his face full of guilt. Julia, I don't even know what to say. We were wrong about everything. You didn't deserve any of this. Their apologies were genuine, but all I could do was nod. I'd waited so long to hear those words, but in that moment, they didn't feel as satisfying as I thought they would. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. My mom couldn't stop apologizing, her voice trembling as she reached out to touch my arm. Julia, we've been so blind. I don't know how we didn't see it. I don't know how we could have been so unfair to you. My dad nodded, his eyes filled with guilt. We're sorry, Julia, truly. You've done so much for us, and we failed you. I don't know how we can make it up to you, but I hope you'll give us the chance to try. I looked at both of them, their remorse so raw it was almost overwhelming. For the first time, I saw how much my silence had shielded them from the truth, and how much my decision to let them believe Sarah's lies had cost me. I appreciate your apology, I said softly, my voice steady. But this isn't something we can fix overnight. I need time, and I need space. I need to focus on myself for now. My mom wiped at her tears, nodding quickly. We understand, sweetheart, please don't shut us out. We want to do better. I gave her a small, tired smile and glanced at Sarah, who hadn't moved from her seat, her head bowed in silence. I didn't say another word to her. Instead, I grabbed my coat and walked out of the house, leaving the reunion and all its weight behind. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally putting myself first. As I walked out the door, I didn't look back, and I didn't spare Sarah a single glance. Whatever happened between her and my parents after I left wasn't my concern anymore. For once, I wasn't going to carry their problems on my shoulders. Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. I didn't need to open it to know what it was about. Sure enough, when I checked, there it was. I told them the truth, Julia. Now can you send me the money we talked about? I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a pang of something. Anger? Pity? Maybe both. It didn't take her long to come knocking, did it? I took a deep breath, knowing exactly how I was going to respond. I replied calmly, "Meet me at Mom and Dad's house. Let's talk there." I didn't give any further details and left it at that. By the time Sarah showed up, I was already sitting in the living room with our parents. Their expressions were somber, a mixture of disappointment and sadness that made the air in the room feel heavy. Sarah walked in, her eyes flicking between us, her confident facade faltering. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. I held up my phone and showed her the message she sent me. "I thought it was time Mom and Dad saw this," I said evenly. "So they'd know that the only reason you finally told the truth yesterday was because you needed money from me." My voice didn't waver. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. Mom's face turned red and Dad sighed, rubbing his temples as the reality sank in. "I'm not giving you the money, Sarah," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Telling the truth was something you should have done a long time ago. Not because you needed something from me, but because it was the right thing to do. I'm not going to reward you for finally doing the bare minimum after all these years." I stood up, grabbing my bag as Sarah's face crumpled. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, Julia," she sobbed, clutching at my arm. "I'm begging you. I don't know what else to do." I pulled my arm free, looking down at her one last time. "That's not my problem anymore, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, her cries echoing behind me as I closed the door. For the first time, I felt no guilt, just relief. As I walked away from the house, the weight I'd carried for years finally lifted. I didn't feel anger or regret, just a quiet sense of freedom. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning up the mess. It was time to focus on my own life, leaving Sarah and the past exactly where they belonged, behind me.